Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about the export of Russian oil, gasoline and diesel because Russia is still entirely dependent on the revenue that it earns from those fossil fuel sales. And unfortunately, as a result of the combination of both the sanctions and the attacks that are taking place on all of the Russian refineries, Russia is now losing tens of billions of dollars of revenue. In fact, it might be even more than that. And Russia has now announced that the gasoline export ban that it originally announced back in August, that was only meant to be a temporary measure through to the end of December, has now been extended to the end of February. And this also incorporates diesel. And one of the problems from Russia's point of view is that these refined products are the highest margin products that Russia sells because crude oil is no good to anybody. You can't actually use crude oil in any machinery. It's too thick. It doesn't really work. So you need to pass it through a refinery process to crack it and break it down into usable products such as gasoline, diesel, kerosene, airline fuel, all of those sort of things. So when you do that, you're adding value to that crude oil. And so you can sell it for more than $100 per barrel. And if we have a look at the impact of this gasoline and diesel ban on the Russian economy, I think it really puts into perspective the problems that Russia is encountering right now. So prior to this ban being introduced, Russia was exporting around 190,000 barrels of gasoline per day and 400,000 barrels of diesel. It exports more diesel because the countries that it's selling into predominantly use diesel rather than gasoline. And if we assume a price of around $100 per barrel for both of those products, just to keep it simple, then the revenue that Russia is losing is $19 million per day for gasoline and $40 million for diesel. So that's almost $60 million per day. Now you might think, well, $60 million, that doesn't sound like that much in the context of Russia's budget. But if we have a look at what that means, between the 1st of August and the 31st of December, that represents 153 days, losing $59 million per day. So in total, that's $9 billion that the Russian economy has lost so far through the end of 2025. And with this extension now being pushed out to the end of February, that will be another 59 days. So that means another $3.5 billion of lost revenue. So that's $12.5 billion in total. And just to put that into context, Russia's budget for education in 2025 was $16 billion. So $12.5 billion is basically more than Russia was spending on education because this was only for a short period. If you extend that through for a full year, we'd be talking close to $20 billion here. So more than Russia is spending on education, it's lost as a result of this self-imposed ban. Now, just before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, NordVPN, who I've actually been working with for a very long time. Now, NordVPN is an online protection system, and you might not think that you need one, but if you use Wi-Fi when you go out and about, if you use Wi-Fi in stores or hotels or anywhere that you go, you're opening yourself up to potentially being hacked because hackers prey on people who are using Wi-Fi. And unless you have some sort of protection, you're opening up your passwords and your accounts to potentially being hacked. There's lots of different things that can happen to you when you're using online Wi-Fi. But by using NordVPN, you'll have total protection. Its Threat Protection Pro will give you the protection that you need to make sure that nobody can steal your passwords or take any money from you. And it will also protect you when you're shopping online and doing basically anything. And the great news is that it's not just about protection. It can also open up lots of opportunities for you because you can change your location and access deals that might not be available in your region. And you can also watch entertainment and sports matches and things that are blocked from a geopolitical perspective. So it is a fantastic product. That's why I've been working with these guys for so long. And the great news is that Joe Blogs viewers can get an additional 4 months extra on a subscription, which you can access by going to nordvpn.com/Joe Blogs or clicking the link in the description below. Now, the reason why Russia introduced this self-imposed ban is because it was suffering shortages in its home market. people were going to the pumps in certain regions and basically being told that they could only buy 5 litres of fuel. Now, obviously, that's not going to help you if you need to fill up your vehicle because you've got lots of deliveries to make, or you're a farmer and you're needing to do all of the harvesting. So Russia decided that it wanted to protect its domestic market by cutting off all of these exports. But the problem with that is obviously it's cutting off all of that revenue that was fueling the Russian state. And the reason why it's had to introduce these bans is because the refineries are not producing enough gasoline and diesel to meet both the domestic and the export demand. And one of the reasons for that is because of all of the drone attacks that Ukraine have been launching. They've specifically been targeting oil and gas refineries. And even if a drone attack only takes out a small area of the refinery, in many cases, Russia is having to close down that refinery for days or weeks because the process depends on all of the different parts. You can't just carry on if one of the crucial parts in the chain has been taken out. So what this tells us is that Ukraine's targeting of refineries is starting to work and is having a massive impact on Russia's revenue. But it's also struggling with regards to crude oil exports as a result of the fact that the sanctions have really been ramped up over the past few months. And the application of these sanctions, I think, is what's really hurting Russia, because the two biggest oil companies have now been sanctioned directly, Lukoil and Rosneft, and also tankers are being targeted by Ukrainian drones. And in terms of quantifying the impact of this on Russia's oil exports, this chart shows the volume of Russia's fuel shipments in 2022, 23, 24, and 25. And 2025 is shown by the yellow line. The scale on the right-hand side of this chart is shown in millions of barrels of oil per day. It goes from 1.5 million at the bottom to 3.5 million at the top. So if we have a look at the black line first, which was 2022, you can see that at the start of the year, which was the period that wasn't affected by the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was exporting over 3 million barrels of oil per day. That was impacted quite heavily initially in the first 9 or 10 months. And then at the end of 2022, we saw the volume starting to rise again as India and China increased the amount that they were buying. In fact, India wasn't buying anything from Russia historically, and it then became its single largest customer for a period of time. By the end of 2022, Russia was exporting around 2.7 million barrels of oil per day. If you look at the pink line, you can see that it followed a similar trend to 2022. By the end of 2023, Russia was exporting around 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. Now in 2024, Russia started to feel the impact of the sanctions. They started to be increased. And so it exported less than it had done in the previous 2 years. And at the end of 2024, Russia was exporting around about 2.3 million barrels per day. Now, if we look at the yellow line, you can see that the downward trend has continued. It's run pretty close to the blue line through to August. So similar sort of volume. And this was because India and China were quite happily buying huge quantities of oil every single day. However, Donald Trump and the rest of the West have really ramped up the sanctions in the past few months. As I mentioned earlier, the two biggest oil producers have now been sanctioned directly, and also they've changed the way the oil price cap operates. So it became pretty much ineffective because it was set at $60 per barrel, and oil was trading at around about $60 per barrel. And Russian oil was selling for less than that because it sells at a discount. So it wasn't really working. They then changed it so it's now a 15% discount against the current market price. And if we look at the yellow line over the past few months, you can see that it has now gone significantly downwards. And in November, Russia only exported 1.7 million barrels of oil, which is a lot less than it was exporting in the previous years. Now, the interesting thing is that the sanctions applied against Rosneft and Lukoil didn't actually kick in until the 21st of November. So there was actually a bit of a surge in demand from a number of countries who are trying to beat that deadline. So it will be interesting to see what's happened in December. It's likely that we will see a continued reduction in December. So the volumes could be at the lowest levels during the past 3 years. They're already there, but it could be significantly lower. Could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button? Really helps me with the algorithm and puts a smile on my face. Doesn't cost you anything, and it only takes a second to do it. It also tells me that you'd like to see more videos like that, so please hit that button if you haven't done so already. And also, I'd like to talk to you about my competition that I'm running at the moment. This is another way of funding the channel. YouTube doesn't pay very much. You may have read in the press that everybody on YouTube is a billionaire. I can tell you that's not true. This is my full-time job, and so I'm trying to earn as much income as I can. And another way of supplementing it, as well as all of the great things where people are buying me coffees and sending me YouTube super thanks and signing up as patrons and members, is to hold a competition. So I'm running a competition whereby you can win my property located close to one of the best beaches in the whole of the UK. You can go down there, have some fish and chips, have a pint of beer, have a walk along the seafront, maybe even surf, because you can surf down there. But if you're not interested in my house, I'm also offering an alternative of £250,000 in cash in any currency that you like. So have a look at the QR code on the screen now. If you scan that with your phone, it'll take you straight through to the site where you can buy a ticket. It's all being run by an independent company. It's not me that's going to choose the winner. It will be done at random independently. So you've got just as good a chance as everybody else, but you have to buy a ticket. So please do that, support the channel, and let's get back to the information. And in terms of looking at what's happening right now, this chart shows the number of tankers loading crude at Russian terminals on December the 7th and December the 14th. And you can see, if we look at December the 7th first, that across all of the different terminals, 38 tankers loaded up with crude oil. On December the 14th, that figure was reduced to 27 tankers. That represents a reduction of 29% in a 1-week period. So we're already starting to see a major slowdown in terms of the amount of oil that Russia is loading onto tankers. And this chart shows where those tankers are going to. Now, the black section at the bottom shows the volume of crude shipments to China, the pink section to India, and then we've got a yellow section which is unknown. And then there's a green section which is also unknown, but it's unknown Asia and then unknown rest of the world. So what you can see is a very clear trend that China has maintained its purchases from Russia pretty much throughout the whole of the war in Ukraine. In fact, it's increased since 2022. But if you look at the far right-hand side here, in terms of what's happened through to the end of November, you can see a significant downward movement. And the amount that China has bought is down to its lowest level since the start of 2022. But the biggest change on this chart is what's happened with India. You can see that back at the start of 2022, India didn't buy anything from Russia. It then hugely increased the amount it was purchasing and became its biggest purchaser for a while. But if you look at the far right-hand side here, you can see a dramatic reduction in the amount of crude oil that India is now purchasing from Russia. And this is as a result of the fact that Indian companies are facing the risk of secondary sanctions if they're proven to be continuing to buy Russian oil. And that would mean that they would then be sanctioned themselves, and so they wouldn't be able to deal with anybody. And so Indian companies are pulling back from these purchases because Russia doesn't represent a huge export market for India, and it doesn't want to run the risk of losing all of its exports to the rest of the world. So I think that's an interesting trend. Now, I think what's also very interesting here is that unknown destinations are making up a huge amount of the oil that Russia is still putting onto tankers. But where is that oil going? If we have a look at this breakdown, it shows us the purchases between November the 9th and December the 14th from China, India, and other countries. So if we look at November the 9th first, at that time, China was buying 1.4 million barrels of crude oil per day. These are just shipments because China does take some through pipelines as well. If we now look at December the 14th, you can see that that 1.4 figure has reduced to 0.8. So that's a huge reduction in the daily purchases from China. If you look at India, it's actually worse because back on November the 9th, India purchased 1.65 million barrels per day. That figure is now down to 0.8. So that's less than half of what India was purchasing 6 weeks previously. The other column is irrelevant here. If we now look at unknown Asia, on November the 9th, it was 0.14 million barrels per day. By December the 14th, it was 1.62. It's actually the biggest single category. So where is all of this oil going? who is buying this oil that Russia is putting onto ships? Well, the answer to that is nobody, because this chart shows us how many barrels of Russian oil are currently sitting on tankers that are just floating around on the ocean. They don't have anywhere to go because there are no actual buyers. So this chart, if you look at the right-hand side, the scale goes from 110 million barrels at the bottom to 180 million at the top. So back in January of this year, around about 118 million barrels of oil were on the ocean at any one time. So that represented the normal shipping, because it can take 3 or 4 or 6 weeks for this oil to actually reach its destination. So at any one time, you'll have lots of tankers that are transporting Russian oil to their destination. Now, interestingly, if you look at 2025, in the first half of the year, the amount of oil on the ocean started to increase. So it got up to around about 140 million barrels. And this represents the period when demand for Russian oil was increasing. India and China were quite happily buying more, so more oil was being put onto tankers to be delivered to them. However, as the sanctions started to ramp up, we started to see the amount of oil coming back down towards that figure that we saw back at the start of the year, the sort of normalized level of Russian oil being transported. However, since August, we have seen a massive increase. And the reason for this is because Russia doesn't have anywhere to store oil. So as the orders have started to reduce from India and China, Russia doesn't want to cut its production because that will cause major problems in the future. So it's continuing to pump as much oil. It's continuing to load it onto tankers, but those tankers don't have anywhere to deliver to. So they're literally just floating around full of Russian oil. And what that means is that Russia isn't being paid for this oil, despite the fact that it's produced it and refined it and put it onto tankers. If you haven't got anybody to buy it, you're not going to receive any cash. And if I have a look at this chart, it shows the value of Russia's crude oil exports dating back to the start of the war in Ukraine. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart is shown in billions of US dollars and goes from 0.5 billion at the bottom to 2.5 billion at the top. Now, if you have a look at April of 2024, it shows that Russia was earning $2.15 billion per week from its oil exports. So that was obviously pretty healthy. Russia was happy at that point. If we wind forward a year to March of 25, that figure had reduced to 1.45 billion, so a significant reduction. However, if we look at the latest figures, they show that Russia is now earning $0.8 billion per week. So compared to where it was in April of 24, that is a massive reduction. It's earning around 30% of what it was earning 18 months ago. And this really shows the impact of both the sanctions and Ukraine's targeting of Russian oil and gas facilities. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because what's happening with Russia's oil and gas exports is obviously critical to the Russian economy. And in fact, oil is now the single biggest product line because gas was pretty much wiped out as a result of the fact that Europe turned its back on Russia immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, and those pipelines had been set up mainly to deliver to Europe. So Russia is still earning something from its gas, but it's significantly less important than it was at the start of the war. So it's now all about oil, and particularly refined oil products, because crude oil is just the basic raw material. You take it out of the ground, you put it onto a ship, and then when it gets to its destination, somebody has to do something with it. They have to refine it before anybody can use it, because you can't put crude oil into your car. It simply wouldn't work. So Russia has set up 44 mega refineries. That's basically an industry in itself. It employs hundreds of thousands of people. Lots of people are dependent on those refineries for their livelihood. And Russia has been processing millions of barrels of oil every single day, producing gasoline and diesel and jet fuel and all the rest of it, and happily selling that all across the world. And it's making much bigger profit margins on those products than it does on crude oil. So this is actually the jewel in the crown of the Russian oil industry. So what Ukraine has been doing over the past 18 months or so is targeting those Russian oil refineries, and particularly over the past 6 months or so. Since August of last year, they started having success with drones. They were getting through the Russian defenses. They were able to travel much further, up to 1,000 miles in some instances, to cause damage. And as I said earlier in the video, you don't have to blow up the whole refinery. You can just take out one particular part, and it may mean that that refinery closes for a day or a week or a month. So it's causing major problems from Russia's point of view. So many problems, in fact, that Russia in August of last year introduced what it called a temporary ban on gasoline and diesel exports. And the reason why it did that was because there were shortages in Russia, and Russia wanted to make sure that its domestic market was protected. Well, as I said at the beginning of today's video, that temporary ban that was in place through to the end of 2025 has now been extended for the first 2 months of 2026. And realistically, it's probably going to be extended indefinitely because Ukraine is seeing the success that it's having with these attacks, and it's continuing to target all of those facilities, as well as other things like ports and some factories now. And as we saw earlier in today's video, the impact in terms of revenue of the loss of these exports from Russia's point of view so far is around 9 billion. It will be about 12.5 billion through to the end of February. And to put that into context, if you annualize that, that is more than Russia is spending on education. So education is obviously very important to the future of your country. In fact, it's an obvious thing to say, but the youth are the future of any country. So you need to educate them. You need to make sure that they're getting more knowledgeable, particularly from Russia's point of view, because they've got severe sanctions in place. They're needing to depend on their own ideas and innovation more than ever before. So this really puts into context the damage that this ban has caused to the Russian economy and the loss of income, how important it is. But unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, it's not just the loss of the refined products, it's also the loss of crude oil revenue. And as we saw in the second part of today's video, crude oil revenues are down to around 30% of what they were at the height back in April of 2024. Russia is losing lots of revenue as a result of the increase in the sanctions, particularly the sanctions that have been applied against the two biggest oil producers, Lukoil and Rosneft. Now, we haven't really seen the full impact of that coming out yet because those sanctions only took effect on the 21st of November. So we're just starting to see the figures coming through in the past couple of days. But as we roll forward in the next 3, 6, 12 months, it's likely that Russia is going to lose billions, tens of billions of dollars because of those sanctions. And all of this is telling us that Russia is rapidly running out of cash because it's already spending more than it's earning. And if the earnings are now going down significantly, then that deficit is going to increase. The only way that Russia can fund that deficit is either from the National Wealth Fund, which will soon be extinguished, or from taking on more debt. So I think all of this tells us that the Russian economy is in serious difficulty right now. And I think the likelihood of a peace deal being agreed at some point in the next 6 to 12 months is now much higher than it was previously because the walls are closing in on the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Don't forget that I'm holding a competition at the moment, another way of funding the channel, whereby you can win my beach house, which is close to one of the best beaches in the whole of the UK. And if you're not interested in that, then you can take the cash prize alternative, which is £250,000. So please have a look at the QR code on the screen now, which will take you through to the independent company that's hosting this competition for me. You can buy tickets for £5 each, and you'll get some bonus tickets if you buy multiple tickets. So have a look at that. It's a bit of fun. Hopefully you'll enjoy it as well. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a Patreon, YouTube member, or buy me a coffee member, thank you so much for that support. Really helps to keep you motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.